Hey everybody, my name is Paul Vacheski and welcome to the Real Estate Classroom YouTube channel, where my mission is simple, and that's to help you pass your real estate exam the first time. All right, key vocabulary words you need to know for your real estate licensing exam. Number 243, agency. When does an agency relationship, or when does agency happen? Well, it happens when a party, such as a seller, appoints another party, like a real estate agent, to act on their behalf when they are transacting with a third party. So the seller hires or appoints that listing agent, who is a licensed individual, to represent them in the real estate transaction with a buyer. Now, in an agency relationship, there are three common parties that you have to know. There is the client, or sometimes known as the principal. They hire the agent, or sometimes called the licensee. And then we also have what's called a customer, or an unrepresented third party. The biggest difference between the client and the customer is the agent or licensee, they owe those fiduciary duties to the client, but they don't owe those fiduciary duties to the customer. And we're going to talk about fiduciary duties in the next slide here. So that's the biggest difference. The client is represented by the agent. The agent can work with a customer, but they do not represent them. All right. So, number 244, I want to talk about those fiduciary duties. Now remember, when a seller, when a buyer, when a tenant, or an owner, in the case of a leasing situation or a property management situation, when they hire that agent or licensee to represent them, when that happens, then that agent owes their client these fiduciary duties. And those fiduciary duties are loyalty and honesty, obedience, full disclosure, skill and care, confidentiality, and accounting. Now, these terms may vary a little bit, at least in how they're identified, depending on the state that you're in. But the basic, most states follow this: loyalty, obedience, full disclosure, skill, care, confidentiality, and accounting. We're not going to go into what each one of those means, because I've already did videos on that. Now, if an agent or licensee is doing a deal with a customer, let me give you a common scenario. The listing agent has the property listed. They represent the seller. That seller is the client. A buyer comes in off an open house and they want to write an offer, and they want to use that listing agent. That listing agent has decided, in this case, to work with that buyer as a customer. The client is the seller, the buyer is the customer, meaning that agent owes no fiduciary duties to that customer. However, as you can see on your screen, that agent still must disclose agency, meaning they must disclose to that buyer who they represent. They cannot in any way misrepresent anything. They must present that buyer's offer in a timely manner. They must provide good services, and they must also provide that customer information. For example, the buyer may ask, do you know any good loan officers, or do you know a home inspector, etc. They must provide information, or information about the house in and of itself. Remember the difference. The client is represented, the customer is not. They can still work with the customer, they just don't owe them those fiduciary duties like they do their clients. Sorry, I'm killing a dead horse here, but I just really want to make sure that you grasp this, because agency can be very confusing to a lot of people. Number 245. Now we're going to get into the actual types of agency relationships. The first one I want to talk about is a special agency. A special agency is a type of agency that's created when a client authorizes an agent to perform. All right. Now, depending on the type of agency, the client is going to have an expectation of the level of performance of that agent. And the first one I want to talk about is special agency, right? So special agency is where the client is authorizing the agent to do one specific thing or one specific act, to sell their house, or if in the case of a buyer, to find a house for that buyer. In the case of a tenant, find that tenant a place to rent. In the case of an owner, to manage the property or to find a tenant for the property that they have for lease. It ends right there with that one specific act. And once that listing agent finds a buyer for that seller and the deal is transacted and closed, then that agency relationship ends. Now, along with that one specific act, there's also a limited time, limited authority, and limited purpose provision. So for example, special agency, and I'm the listing agent, I'm listing your property. The one specific act is to list the property and find a buyer. However, I have a limited amount of time to do that because all listing contracts have an expiration date. I have limited authority. I can't speak on behalf of you as the seller. So maybe the buyer asks me, hey, how much off the list price is that seller willing to come down? I can't answer that question because I would be speaking on your behalf. It's very limited in authority in what I can do. I'm basically the messenger. I purvey back and forth the messages between the buyer and the seller. Limited purpose, limited time, authority, and purpose, meaning what's my purpose under this relationship, and that is to find a willing, able, qualified buyer. So here are some examples of limited agency. There is a seller agency, so that agent is representing the seller trying to find a buyer. That agent is representing a buyer trying to find a seller. That agent is representing the landlord or the owner trying to find a tenant, and the agent represents a tenant who's trying to find a property to rent. Those are examples or situations when special agency is in play. Say thank you by supporting our channel, and there's a couple of ways that you can do that. Number one, subscribe to the channel and click that little notification bell. Helps the channel grow. And number two, right below this video is a super thanks button. It's a heart with a $sign in the middle. I provide all this content for free, and my mission really is to help you pass the real estate exam the first time. So please, if you have a couple of dollars you wouldn't mind parting with, donate it down below. I would appreciate that. Let's get back to today's video. Number 246 is general agency. Now, under a general agency relationship, the agents have far more latitude to speak on behalf of the client, to make decisions on behalf of their client, but it's not complete and total authority. There are established limitations on how far that licensee can go when they're speaking on behalf of their client. This is typically created by what's called a limited power of attorney. The two most common examples that I see general agency is a property management situation and a salesperson or associate broker relationship with their designated broker. All right, so let me give you an example. Under property management, it's very common that the property manager is allowed to spend up to a certain dollar amount for maintenance. So maybe a common dollar amount is $300 or $500. So the property manager receives a call from the tenant who says that the toilet's plugged up, and the property manager is going to send out a plumber. That property manager, under this type of an agreement, has the authority to call the plumber directly and schedule the repairs up to a certain dollar amount without having to contact the owner and getting their permission. If it's over that dollar amount, then they have to contact the owner to get permission to spend the extra money. Where we see it in the salesperson or associate broker in the designated broker relationship is, let's use the listing contract. The listing contract, you have to know this for your real estate exam, is between the broker, the designated broker, and the seller. However, it is that salesperson or that associate broker that's going out and securing that listing contract by signing it. They are negotiating the terms, they are negotiating the commission amount, and then they're going to sign that listing contract. Well, they're signing that listing contract on behalf of that designated broker. And in reality, most designated brokers put certain limitations on what that listing agent can and can't negotiate, what that salesperson or associate broker can and can't negotiate with the seller. That is general agency. Number 247 is what's called universal agency. This is usually created by a power of attorney, but it's a general power of attorney. Under the general agency relationship, there was a limited power of attorney. Under universal agency, it is a general power of attorney where the agent is allowed to pretty much do whatever they want on behalf of the client. So let me give you an example. I have known legitimate situations where an owner had a universal agency relationship with their agent. Usually it's an attorney, and that attorney is going out and buying properties on the owner's behalf. They have a broad authority when it comes to making decisions. And it's not for one specific purpose like we see in general agency, where that limited power of attorney is just for property management functions. It's very uncommon, but it is something that is out there, and I guarantee it is something that you need to know for your real estate exam. Number 248 is what's called ostensible agency. Now, in some states, it's called implied agency or agency by estoppel. And essentially, this is created when a third party is led to believe that someone is their agent. So let me give you the most common example. We have Agent Tim and Agent Sarah. So Agent Tim tells Agent Sarah that he has his neighbor's house listed for sale, when in fact that's not true. But Sarah is led to believe that Agent Tim is their agent. All right. Agent Sarah takes her buyer through the property. The seller is home. And through that conversation, Sarah is led to believe, either by the direct conversation with the seller or the seller not denying the fact that Agent Tim is representing them, Agent Sarah walks away with no reason to believe that Tim doesn't actually represent this seller. So Agent Sarah moves forward working with Agent Tim to try to get the transaction put together. That is what we called ostensible agency. That third party, that Agent Sarah was led to believe that Agent Tim represented the seller. We also see this in some sub-agency situations as well, but that is ostensible agency. 249 is sub-agency. Sub-agency is actually pretty simple. That means that a seller has made a decision that anyone who's going to involve themselves in the transaction is going to have to be a sub-agent. So a seller hires a listing agent to list the property. All right, so Agent Tim represents the seller. Every other agent that's not Tim is what's considered a sub-agent to the seller. So all of these different buyer's agents within the community that have buyers, if they're going to come forward and submit an offer, they're going to be a sub-agent of the seller, meaning they represent the seller. They owe the seller all of those fiduciary duties that we talked about, I believe, in number 244. Loyalty and honesty and obedience and all of that. Even though that sub-agent doesn't even work for the same company as Agent Tim, who is listed the property here. Typically, this is established through commission, although it doesn't have to be. Typically, where I see this is the seller says, here's the deal. If Agent Paul is a buyer's agent and he has a buyer, if he wants any commission whatsoever, any buyer's cooperating commission, then he's going to have to be my sub-agent. If not, he can represent the buyer, that's fine, but I'm not paying any kind of commission. So in that scenario, we have Agent Tim, who represents the seller, Agent Paul, who represents the buyer. So Agent Tom comes along and says, well, I want to get paid, but he works for a different company. So the seller says, if you want to get paid a commission, then you're going to have to be a sub-agent. So the listing agent, Agent Tim, represents the seller, but Agent Tom also represents the seller, owing the seller all of those fiduciary duties that we talked about in vocabulary word 244, like obedience and loyalty and confidentiality. Now, typically what happens, to make it a little more confusing, is Agent Tom, who has the buyer who works for a different company, is going to represent the seller, but they also represent the buyer. So that's going to end up being what's called a dual agency in the end. It's a little bit confusing, and I wanted to illustrate it here for you, but essentially what you need to know for the real estate commission, for the real estate exam is a seller's subagent owes all the fiduciary duties just like the seller's listing agent does. They owe all of those fiduciary duties. All right, number 250, dual agency. This one is simple. This is where the licensee represents both parties or all parties in the same real estate transaction. So we have the licensee who represents, remember, representation means those fiduciary duties are owed to the client. So that licensee represents the seller and the buyer, or the owner and the tenant. They represent all parties or both parties in the same real estate transaction. And last but not least, 251, and down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, I actually misnumbered this. It should be 243 through 251. But I do want to talk about what's called a facilitator or a transactional broker. Many states allow this, but many do not. So you have to know your specific state and what their state law is regarding this. For example, I'm in Nebraska, and we don't allow legally this type of transaction. So it looks a lot like dual agency, where you have one licensee, and they are writing up the real estate transaction for a buyer and the seller, or an owner and a tenant, but they have no representation to any party. They do not owe those fiduciary duties to either party. They are simply facilitating the transaction. That is it. In many states, they require the licensee to have the buyer and the seller, or the owner and the tenant, sign what's called a customer disclaimer or a customer disclosure, where, remember, we talked about earlier in the video that an agent, when they're working with a customer, they still have to be honest. They still have to disclose if there's any agency. They still have to provide information, etc. They owe those same kind of duties, if you will, to the buyer and the seller, owner and tenant, but they don't represent them. So some states, it's just they don't have to do anything. In other states, they have to sign a customer disclosure. But in any event, what you have to know about a facilitator or a transactional broker is they do not represent any party in the transaction. They are just doing the paperwork and facilitating the transaction. That is it. All right, don't forget to subscribe, hit that little notification bell, and check out this video right here. See you in the next video, everyone.